The sky was bleeding out, painting the Montana pasture in the last violent colors of dusk. Eleanora Whitfield didn't feel the sharp rocks or the thorns tearing at her bare feet. The pain was a distant drumbeat, lost beneath a single deafening terror. The silence. Her baby, Anna Grace, had stopped crying hours ago. That was the sound that terrified her most, the absence of it. Her daughter's breathing was a fragile whisper against her own frantic heartbeat. Nora pressed her ear to the baby's lips, praying to feel the faintest puff of air. It was there, barely. A fever was raging through the infant's tiny body, her skin hot and damp to the touch. Nora's arms, screaming with exhaustion, trembled as she clutched the child to her chest. She would not let go. She would never let go. "Stay with me, little bird," Nora murmured, her own voice a raw crackle. "Please, just stay with me." Ahead, a silhouette clawed at the dying light. A place she'd only heard about in hushed, fearful whispers. The Hargrove Dairy Ranch, home of the phantom millionaire, William Hargrove. They said his wealth was built on an empire of cattle, on cheese and milk that were famous in 3 counties. They said his land was so vast it swallowed the horizon whole. They also said he was a ghost, a man who had buried his wife and child on the same grim afternoon and hadn't spoken a word to another soul since. Some called him heartless. Others said he was dangerous. Nora wasn't afraid of dangerous men anymore. She'd already survived the worst kind. The only thing she feared now was the vacant look in her daughter's eyes, the look of a life already surrendering. The ranch gate loomed ahead, a dark skeletal barrier between life and death. 2 massive posts and heavy planks, weathered by 1,000 lonely winds. Then, a scent drifted on the breeze. Wood smoke, and something else. Freshly boiled milk. The smell was so potent, so full of life, that Nora's stomach clenched in a spasm of hunger. Her knees buckled. Her legs finally gave out. She collapsed onto the cold, hard ground just feet from the gate, shielding Anna Grace with her own body. "Just a little milk," she whispered to the wind, a prayer too weak to carry. "Please, God, just a little." The night crept in, its shadows stretching like long, dark fingers across the fields. Somewhere nearby, a cow lowed, a deep, soft sound that twisted Nora's heart. Milk. So close. The one thing that might pull her daughter back from the brink. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Purposeful. Nora's heart slammed against her ribs. She forced her head up, her vision blurring. A tall figure stood behind the wooden gate, a broad-shouldered silhouette cutting a hole in the twilight. He was as still as a gravestone. He didn't speak. He just watched. "Please!" Nora choked out, the word tearing from her throat. "Sir, my baby, she's sick. I just need some milk. I can work. I can pay you." The man remained silent. The silence was so profound she could hear the ragged, desperate rhythm of her own breathing. For one long, agonizing moment, she thought he would simply turn and walk away, leaving her to die at his gate. Then, with a low, mournful groan, the gate creaked open. He was taller than any man she'd ever seen, with the lean, powerful build of someone who had spent a lifetime wrestling with the land. His dark hair, shot through with silver at the temples, fell just over a pair of sharp, brutally serious eyes. He wore a faded work shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms that were a roadmap of scars and muscle. But it wasn't his size that held her captive. It was the stillness, the crushing weight of his silence. He looked at her with a steady, unspoken assessment that made her breath catch. There was no cruelty in his eyes, but something else she couldn't place. Something that felt like recognition. And then his gaze fell to the tiny bundle in her arms. Something in his expression fractured. The hard lines of his face seemed to soften, just for a second, like a man watching an old wound bleed anew. "She's burning up," Nora said, tears finally breaking free, hot against her cold skin. "Please, I haven't eaten in days. I have no milk left for her." The giant of a man, William Hargrove, crouched down, his boots grinding softly on the dirt. He reached out his hands. They were huge, calloused, but they hesitated, trembling slightly, as if the baby were made of spun glass. Every instinct screamed at Nora to recoil, to protect her child from this stranger. But then she saw it. The aching tenderness in his eyes as they lingered on Anna Grace's tiny, fevered face. Slowly, she surrendered her daughter into his arms. Anna Grace looked impossibly small, impossibly fragile against the solid wall of his chest. Hargrove cradled her with a surprising, innate care, his large hands supporting her head. His own breath seemed to quicken as he felt the sheer heat radiating from her body. Without a single word, he stood, turned toward the ranch house, and gestured with his head for Nora to follow. The world tilted. Nora tried to push herself up, but her legs were useless. A hand extended toward her. It was rough and scarred, yet impossibly warm. She took it, allowing him to pull her to her feet like she weighed nothing. The ranch yard was lit by the soft golden glow of lanterns. She saw corrals filled with calm, dark-eyed cows, their breath misting in the cool night air. The house was simple but solid, built of stone and dark wood. It smelled of smoke and age and something else, something like long-forgotten grief. He didn't stop. He went straight for the kitchen, holding Anna Grace securely in the crook of one arm. With the other, he reached for a metal pail of fresh milk, still warm from the evening's milking. His movements were efficient, practiced. It was clear this was not the first time he had cared for something so fragile. Nora stood frozen in the doorway, a ghost in her own story, torn between overwhelming gratitude and a dizzying disbelief. The stories were all wrong. The silent, heartless monster of Meadowbrook was saving her child. For the first time in a very, very long time, she allowed herself to hope. As William Hargrove moved to the hearth to warm the milk, the firelight danced across his face, revealing a man who was both deeply scarred and profoundly human. He looked down at Anna Grace with something that bordered on reverence, as if holding this tiny life had awakened a part of himself he'd thought was dead and buried. The baby stirred, a faint, weak whimper. Nora's heart seized. Will she be okay?" she asked, her voice a fragile thing. William Hargrove looked up, his gray-blue eyes locking onto hers. They were steady, clear, and for the first time since she'd arrived, they held a promise. He gave the smallest of nods. And in that moment, in the house of a man who had lost everything, Nora felt the first, tiny spark of safety. The kitchen was a sanctuary of warmth. It smelled of wood smoke, fresh hay, and the sweet, life-giving aroma of the milk simmering over the fire. Nora hovered by the door, her arms wrapped around her own shivering frame, her eyes never leaving Anna Grace. The baby was nestled in William Hargrove's powerful arms, her flushed face resting against his chest. He moved with a quiet, deliberate precision, his broad shoulders squared, as if every small action carried the weight of the world. He tested the milk with his little finger, his expression one of intense concentration. Nora watched, caught in a whirlwind of confusion. She had expected a monster. She had found a guardian. "Does she drink well?" His voice startled her. It was low and rough, like stones grinding together, the sound of a voice long unused. For a second she didn't even realize he had spoken. The townspeople swore he never did. She nodded quickly, her hand flying to her face to wipe away the grime and tears. "She hasn't had anything for almost 2 days," Nora said, her own voice breaking. I tried to give her water, but..." She turned away, ashamed of the fear that was eating her alive. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He didn't press. Instead, he took a clean square of cotton cloth and a small glass jar, fashioning a makeshift bottle with practiced ease. He sat down in a sturdy wooden chair by the fire, shifting the baby gently into the crook of his arm. The first few drops of warm milk touched Anna Grace's lips. For one heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Nora's breath caught, her chest tight with a terrible dread. Then, Slowly, miraculously, the baby latched onto the cloth. She began to suckle. Weakly at first, then with more strength. Her tiny fingers, barely larger than a twig, curled around Will's rough index finger, gripping it with a fierce primal instinct. It was as if she knew, as if she understood that this man, this silent stranger, had just offered her life itself. Tears blurred Nora's vision. She sank into the chair across from him, her body finally succumbing to a wave of relief, so powerful it felt like pain. "Thank you," she whispered, the words almost inaudible. "You saved her." Will didn't respond with words. He just looked at her, his eyes steady and searching. For a moment, Nora felt stripped bare, as though he could see every scar she carried, inside and out. She lowered her gaze, unable to bear the intensity. When Anna Grace had finally had her fill, her belly full for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Will gently wrapped her in a soft woolen blanket he retrieved from a large cedar chest in the corner. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender and disuse. Nora's heart twisted. These were things that had been kept for a child who would never use them again. His child. He carefully laid the sleeping baby in a wicker basket he'd lined with cushions, placing it near the warmth of the hearth. Anna Grace let out a soft, contented sigh, her breathing already deeper, stronger. "You must be starving," he said. It wasn't a question. He rose, moving to the large black iron pot that simmered on the stove. He ladled a thick, fragrant stew into a bowl. The scent of beef, carrots, and potatoes filled the room, making Nora's head swim. He placed the bowl on the table in front of her, along with a thick slice of dark bread. "Eat," he commanded, his voice quiet but firm. Her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon. The warmth of the broth spread through her body like a slow-burning miracle. She ate greedily, messily, not caring how she looked. She was a starving animal, and he had given her food. Will sat across from her, not eating, just watching. His presence was as solid and unmovable as the stone walls of the house, protective, yet impossibly distant. Between mouthfuls, Nora found her courage. "The people in town, they say you're dangerous," she said, her voice small. "They say you keep to yourself." She hesitated, wondering if she was crossing a line. "I don't think they know you at all." A muscle in Will's jaw twitched. He looked away toward the fire, as if her words had stirred something he'd worked hard to bury. "People talk," he said finally, his voice hollow. "It doesn't matter." But it did matter. Something in his tone, a raw, serrated edge, told her that the whispers of the town were the least of the pains he carried. She wanted to ask more, to understand the grief that had entombed this man. But his silence was a fortress. Instead, she finished the stew, feeling strength return to her limbs. As the fire crackled, Will knelt by the basket, his large hand gently adjusting the blanket around Anna Grace. Nora watched the incredible care in his movements, the almost reverent way he tucked the corners to shield the baby from any possible draft. It struck her then, with stunning clarity. A man like this, wealthy, powerful, solitary, had absolutely no reason to open his door to a desperate, half-dead stranger. He could have turned her away. He could have let them perish at his gate. No one would have ever known. And yet, he hadn't. "Do you have family?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. His movements stilled. He remained kneeling by the fire, his back to her, for a long, heavy moment. Then he stood, turning to face her, his eyes shadowed by a pain so old it seemed ancient. "I did," he said, his voice rough with unspoken emotion. That was all. The finality in his words was a closed door. Nora knew not to knock. Outside, the wind howled, a lonely sound that rattled the window panes. Will moved to the front door, checking the heavy latch. "You can't go back out there tonight," he stated. "It's too far, too cold." "I can't stay," Nora murmured, though her exhausted body screamed in protest. She looked at Anna Grace, sleeping peacefully, and her heart clenched. "I don't want to bring my trouble here. Will studied her, his gaze unwavering. "Trouble has a way of finding people who don't deserve it," he said, the words heavy with a wisdom born of suffering. "You and your baby will stay. You'll stay until she's well." His tone left no room for argument. It wasn't a command. It was a promise. He led her to a small, simple guest room. He had already laid fresh linens on the bed, linens that smelled of cedar and clean air. Nora placed the basket with Anna Grace beside her bed. She touched her daughter's forehead. It was cooler now. The fever was starting to break. Before leaving her to rest, Will paused in the doorway. His large frame seemed to fill the entire space. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone carved by grief. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll be up early to check the herd. I'll bring more milk after." She wanted to thank him again, to find the words for the monumental gratitude that was swelling in her chest, but they wouldn't come. She just nodded, watching him disappear down the dark hall. When she finally lay down, the mattress felt impossibly soft, a luxury she hadn't known in months. As sleep began to pull her under, she heard something. It was faint, coming from the main room, a low, rough humming. It was a lullaby, halting and out of tune but unmistakable. William Hargrove, the silent man of the mountains, the heartless recluse, was singing to her child. Nora closed her eyes and tears slipped silently down her cheeks. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were not tears of fear. They were tears of something fragile and terrifying and beautiful. They were tears of hope. The morning sun rose pale and hesitant over the Montana hills, casting a thin, golden light across the vast, frosted fields. Nora woke with a start, disoriented by the impossible softness of the bed and the profound silence of the room. It was the first time in months she hadn't woken up to the sharp bite of cold ground or the gnawing ache of an empty stomach. She looked over. Anna Grace was sleeping soundly in the basket, her tiny fists curled beneath her chin, her breathing steady and strong. The fever was gone. It had broken completely in the night. Relief washed over Nora in a wave so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. From the main room, she heard the faint clatter of a kettle. She padded out quietly, still in her torn, filthy dress, and found William Hargrove standing by the stove. His back was to her, his broad shoulders blocking the morning light from the window. He was pouring steaming coffee into 2 tin mugs. When he sensed her presence, he turned. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but his eyes held no threat. "She's better," Nora said softly. It wasn't a question, but a statement of miraculous fact. Will simply nodded, offering her one of the mugs. The coffee was black and bitter, but it was hot and strong. She wrapped her cold hands around the mug as if it were a lifeline. They drank in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant, mournful lowing of the cows from the barns. There was something grounding in that silence. It wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken things. "I'll need to go into town today," he said suddenly, his rough voice slicing through the quiet. The words were simple, but they carried an authority that made Nora look up. "Medicine," he explained, his gaze flickering briefly to the sleeping baby. "Fresh cloth. Things for her. She'll need more than what I have here." Nora straightened immediately, a familiar shame washing over her. I can go. I don't want to be a burden." The thought of this man, this stranger, spending his time and money on them was too much. She hated this feeling, this constant state of needing to be saved. Will shook his head, his expression firm. "No, you stay here." He looked out the window, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "You're safer here." Safer. That one word made Nora's chest tighten with a cold dread. She thought of Silas. She thought of his cruel hands and his venomous words. The memory was a ghost that haunted her every step. How could this man possibly understand the kind of danger she was in? But the look on his face, a look of grim, world-weary knowledge, told her that he knew more about fear and loss than he would ever say. He saddled his horse, a powerful black stallion that watched him with intelligent eyes. He packed a leather satchel, his movements efficient and deliberate. "I'll be back before noon," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, but the words carried an unspoken promise of his return. "Don't open the door for anyone." She nodded, clutching Anna Grace close as she watched him ride out. The sight of him, a solitary, determined figure against the vast, empty landscape, made something deep inside her chest ache with a feeling she couldn't name. The town of Meadowbrook was just beginning to stir when Will Hargrove rode down its dusty main street. He was a specter, a living legend. People stopped what they were doing to watch him pass. Women paused their morning chores, their hands still, whispering behind cupped palms. Men tipped their hats out of ingrained habit, but none dared to meet his eyes or offer a greeting. Will ignored them all. His focus was singular. He tied his horse in front of Dr. Henley's small, cluttered office. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and dried herbs. Dr. Henley, a wiry man with a bald head and quick, nervous eyes, looked up from his ledger, his pen frozen in midair. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, surprise coloring his voice. "Haven't seen you in months. What can I do for you?" Will didn't waste words. He placed a small, handwritten note on the counter. It had 3 words on it: baby, fever, medicine. Dr. Henley's eyebrows shot up to his hairline. "A baby? Yours?" The question hung in the stale air, heavy and impertinent. Will didn't answer. He simply stared. His gray-blue eyes were as sharp and cold as chips of ice. The doctor suddenly found himself very busy. He cleared his throat, his face flushing, and quickly packed a small pouch with powders and a bottle of dark liquid. "Here," he said, sliding it across the counter. "This will help. Make sure she drinks plenty, and—" The doctor hesitated, then decided to press his luck. "Mr. Hargrove, you know people are going to talk." A muscle in Will's jaw clenched, but he gave no other sign that he'd heard. He took the medicine, gave a barely perceptible nod that might have been a thank you, and left. His next stop was Samuel Morrison's general store. Morrison was a small, anxious man with thinning hair and a perpetual look of worry. When he saw the towering figure of Will Hargrove fill his doorway, he nearly dropped the crate of canned peaches he was stacking. "Morning, sir," he stammered, wringing his hands in his apron. What can I get for you today?" Will handed him another list: fresh milk, oat flour, honey, mild soap, white cotton cloth. Morrison read the list. Then he read it again, his eyes growing wider with each word. "Milk!" he echoed, his voice a squeak of confusion. "But, Mr. Hargrove, you've got hundreds of the finest dairy cows in the state. Why on earth would you—" He stopped abruptly, catching the cold fire in Will's gaze. "Right. Never mind. Of course. I'll get that for you right away." As the flustered storekeeper gathered the items, he kept casting nervous, curious glances at the silent rancher. By the time Will Hargrove left the store, leading his horse now laden with supplies, Morrison was already leaning over the counter, his voice a conspiratorial whisper to the other customers, who had been pretending not to watch. "Something's happening at the Hargrove place," he muttered, his eyes alight with the thrill of gossip. "He bought baby things, honey and soft soap, and he came straight from the doctor's office with medicine." By that afternoon, the whispers had become a firestorm. At the bakery, women speculated that the reclusive Millionaire had finally taken a mistress. At the blacksmith's, men joked nervously that old Hargrove must have a secret family hidden away. It didn't take long for the talk to reach the sheriff's office. Sheriff Ben Cormack was a broad, grizzled man with a face that looked like it had been carved from sun-baked leather. He'd kept the peace in this rough country for 20 years. When he heard the rampant gossip, he let out a long, weary sigh, rubbed his jaw, and swung himself into his saddle. If Will Hargrove had someone staying at that ranch, it was his duty to know about it. Not out of malice. but because the past had taught him one hard lesson. Trouble had a bad habit of finding its way to Hargrove's land. It was nearing sunset when the sheriff rode up the long, lonely dirt road to the ranch house. Nora saw him coming through the window, and her heart leaped into her throat. She had no reason to fear the law, and yet, after so long on the run, any man with a badge felt like a threat. The front door creaked open, and Will stepped inside, his shadow falling across the room. He set down the bags of supplies. He caught the terrified look on Nora's face, her eyes fixed on the approaching rider. "Stay here," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "It's all right." Moments later, Sheriff Cormac dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Evening, Will," he called out, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. "Heard you might have some visitors." Will stepped out onto the porch, crossing his powerful arms over his chest. His face was an impassive mask. "A woman and her child?" the sheriff continued, his voice dropping slightly. "That true, Will?" Will's eyes narrowed, but he gave a single sharp nod. "Folks in town are getting stirred up. You know how they get," Cormac said, leaning against a porch post. "Is there anything I need to know?" Will glanced back toward the window, where he knew Nora was watching, hidden in the shadows. "No trouble," he said at last, his voice flat. "They needed help. I gave it." The sheriff studied his old acquaintance for a long, silent moment. He'd known Will before the silence, before the grief had walled him off from the world. He trusted the man's word, but he also knew that the presence of a desperate woman and a sick baby in this house of ghosts would only feed the fire of speculation. "All right, Will," Cormac said finally, pushing himself off the post. "But you watch yourself. There are always eyes on this ranch." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and unanswered questions in his wake. Inside, Nora released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Will came back in, placing the medicine and the soft cotton cloth on the kitchen table. He met her gaze. "She'll be fine," he said, his eyes moving to the sleeping form of Anna Grace. His tone was firm, but his gaze softened as it lingered on the child. The warmth of the fire filled the silence between them. But Nora couldn't shake a cold, creeping feeling. Something was coming. Somewhere out there, the past she had run from was still hunting her, and she had a terrible feeling that William Hargrove's quiet, solitary world was about to collide with hers in a way neither of them could possibly predict. The next morning broke cold and painfully bright. Nora stood on the porch, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, clutching Anna Grace to her chest. She watched William stride across the yard, his long-legged gait eating up the ground as he headed for the dairy barns. The rhythmic sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the metallic clank of buckets, the steady creak of the windmill had become a strange, comforting heartbeat. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt a sense of stability. But she knew it was a lie. It was a borrowed peace, a fragile shelter that could be shattered at any moment. She couldn't hide here forever. She couldn't let him be her shield. When he returned from the barn, his cheeks flushed from the cold, she met him at the porch steps. "I'm going into town," she announced, her voice steadier than she felt. "There are things we need. More cloth for her, a needle and thread, some bread. I can't ask you to keep being my messenger." Will frowned, his jaw tightening into a hard line. "You don't have to do that. I'll go." "No." She shook her head, a new resolve hardening inside her. "If I hide, it only proves their whispers right. Let them see me. Let them see that I have nothing to be ashamed of." He hesitated, his gray eyes searching her face, weighing her determination against his protective instinct. Finally, he gave a slow nod. He went inside and returned with a small leather pouch heavy with coins. "Stay close to Morrison's store," he instructed, his voice low. "If there's any trouble, you come straight back. You hear me?" She managed a faint, grateful smile. "I will." Meadowbrook was buzzing. It was market day, and the main street was crowded with wagons, farmers, and townspeople. Nora kept her chin high as she walked through the throng, Anna Grace bundled securely in her arms. The baby, her cheeks now rosy with health, looked around with wide, curious eyes. Conversations paused as she passed, heads turned. She could feel the weight of their stares, the heat of their curiosity. But she refused to falter. Inside Morrison's general store, the air smelled of coffee grounds, leather, and dried apples. Mr. Morrison himself greeted her with a stiff, formal nod, his eyes flicking nervously from her face to the healthy baby in her arms. He gathered her purchases: flour, a small jar of honey, a length of good cotton cloth, his movements quick and efficient. He didn't ask questions, but his curiosity was a palpable thing in the small space. She was just counting out the coins onto the counter when the bell over the store door jingled violently, and a voice cut through the air, a voice that was smooth, familiar, and dripping with poison. "Nora!" Her blood ran cold. It felt like ice flooding her veins. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought she might drop the baby. Slowly she turned. There, framed in the doorway, was the man she prayed every night she would never see again. Silas Grober. He was just as she remembered, tall, broad-shouldered, with a cruel smugness that seemed permanently etched on his handsome face. But there was something new. A thin, angry scar ran from his ear to the corner of his mouth, a stark reminder of the violent world he inhabited. His dark eyes raked over her, a possessive, hungry look that made her skin crawl. And then they landed on the baby. His lips curled into a predatory smile. "Well, well," he drawled, taking a deliberate step into the store. "My sweet Nora, I was beginning to think I'd lost you for good." He moved closer, his scent, stale whiskey and cheap cologne, assaulting her. "And this," his gaze dropped to Anna Grace, "this must be our little girl." Nora tightened her grip on the baby, her voice a raw, trembling whisper. "She's not yours. You know she's not." Silas's grin widened, all teeth and malice. "The courts might feel differently. A child born while under my roof? To my wife?" He savored the word. "I have papers, darling. I can prove everything." "You forged those papers!" Nora snapped, her voice cracking with a mix of fury and terror. "We both know the truth, Silas." He ignored her, his eyes sweeping around the store, taking in the rapt audience of customers who were now openly staring. "You've been living well, haven't you?" He sneered, his gaze flicking back to her. "That big, fancy ranch. Who's been keeping you? That ghost everyone's so afraid of? Hargrove?" She took a step back, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Leave us alone." "Oh, I'll leave you alone," he said, his voice dropping to a soft, menacing purr. "Just as soon as I get what belongs to me." He gestured toward the baby. "My child. A daughter of mine belongs with her father." "She is not your child!" Nora cried out. The force of her own voice startled her. Anna Grace, sensing the tension, began to whimper, her little face crumpling. Before Silas could take another step, a new voice cut through the room. It was sharp, clear, and held the authority of a judge's gavel. "Is there a problem here?" It was Judith Ramsey, the town midwife. She stood near the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Her eyes, however, were as sharp and intelligent as a hawk's. She took in the scene in a single glance. "Nora, who is this man?" Silas smirked, turning on the charm. "Her husband," he said smoothly, "and the father of that child." Nora's face flushed with a hot, desperate anger. "No," she said, her voice finding its strength. "You are not my husband, Silas. You never were." Judith's gaze hardened as she looked Silas up and down, her expression one of pure contempt. "I suggest you keep your distance, mister, whoever you are. If you have a dispute, you can take it to the sheriff, but you will not harass this woman in my town." Silas chuckled, a low, ugly sound that grated on Nora's nerves. "Oh, I'll be speaking to the sheriff, all right. I'll tell him exactly who is illegally harboring my wife and child on that big, empty ranch of his. We'll see how your rich protector handles that kind of trouble." Nora's breath hitched. The threat was crystal clear. It wasn't just about her anymore. He was going after Will. Judith Ramsey stepped forward, a small but formidable obstacle placing herself directly between Silas and Nora. "You'll do no such thing," she said, her voice ringing with command. "Now, leave." For a moment, pure, undiluted rage twisted Silas's features. But something in the old woman's unyielding stare made him reconsider. He finally tipped his hat in a mocking gesture of farewell. "This isn't over, Nora," he hissed, his eyes locking on hers. "Not by a long shot." He turned on his heel and strode out, the bell over the door jangling violently in his wake. The store was deathly silent, the only sound the soft, frightened cries of Anna Grace. Nora's knees felt like they were about to give out, but Judith placed a firm, steadying hand on her arm. "You're safe for now, child," the older woman said, her voice softening. "But that man is a snake. If he goes to the sheriff with those lies, this could get very ugly." Nora swallowed hard, her mind racing. "I have to go back," she whispered, "back to the ranch." "You do that," Judith agreed. "And you tell Mr. Hargrove everything that happened. He strikes me as a man who won't be pushed around by the likes of Silas Grober." The walk back to the ranch felt like 100 miles. The weight of fear was a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders. When she finally stumbled into the ranch yard, Will was there, waiting. He must have been watching the road. He took one look at her pale, stricken face and trembling hands, and his own expression hardened into granite. "What happened?" His voice was low, clipped. Standing there in the yard, with the vast, empty landscape stretching out behind them, she told him everything. About Silas, about the forged marriage papers, about his threat to ruin Will's name and take Anna Grace away forever. As she spoke, Will's face became a dark storm cloud. His jaw was set like stone. He didn't interrupt, but the cold fire that ignited in his eyes told her that he understood exactly what kind of monster Silas was. When she finished, her voice trailing off into a choked sob, he stood silent for a long, heavy moment. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face. Then he spoke. "He won't take her," he said, the words simple, but forged from iron. "And he won't take you." Something in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. But it wasn't a shiver of fear. It was something else entirely. It was the feeling, for the first time in this whole nightmare, that she and Anna Grace were no longer alone in the fight. As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long, menacing shadows across the yard, Nora realized the fragile peace she had found here was over. Silas would be back, and next time, he wouldn't come with just words. Will's hand unconsciously brushed the worn leather grip of the revolver he wore at his hip. His eyes, cold and sharp, swept the horizon. The air between them was taut, charged with the grim knowledge of what was coming. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the first drops of rain had begun to fall. The night fell like a shroud, cold and sharp. The kind of absolute Montana darkness that swallowed every star, leaving only the small island of light from the ranch house fire. Nora sat by the hearth, the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair a counterpoint to the frantic pounding of her own heart. Anna Grace slept in her arms, blissfully unaware, her little chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. But Nora's nerves were shredded. Every gust of wind that rattled the windows was the sound of approaching footsteps. Silas's words, "This isn't over," were a venomous echo in her mind. William Hargrove stood near the door, a tall, silent sentinel outlined by the dim lantern glow. He hadn't said much since she'd told him about the confrontation in town. But this was a different kind of silence. This wasn't the hollow, grief-stricken silence she had first encountered. This was focused, controlled, a silence that was simmering with a cold, deadly resolve. He picked up the rifle that leaned by the wall, checking the action with an efficient, mechanical precision that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. "You think he'll come?" Nora asked, her voice barely a whisper, afraid to wake the baby. Will's gaze lifted from the polished steel of the rifle. "He will," he said. The certainty in his voice was chilling. She swallowed hard, clutching Anna Grace a little tighter. "He's dangerous." Will looked at her then, his gray eyes locking onto hers in the flickering firelight. "So am I," he replied. It wasn't a boast. It was a simple statement of fact, spoken with a calm finality that sent a different kind of shiver through her, a shiver of awe. The hours crawled by, each one a small eternity. Nora must have dozed off, because she woke with a start, still in the rocking chair, Anna Grace still bundled in her arms. And then she heard it, the slow, deliberate crunch of boots on the gravel outside. Will's head snapped up. His entire body went rigid, every muscle tensed, yet he moved with a fluid, silent grace. He went to the window, lifting the edge of the curtain just a fraction of an inch. Two shapes loomed in the suffocating darkness. One was unmistakably Silas. The other was a hulking figure holding a long-barreled shotgun. Will turned to Nora. His voice was a quiet command, devoid of panic. "Take her to the back room. Lock the door. And don't come out until I tell you to." Her lips parted to protest, to say she wouldn't leave him alone. But one look into his eyes, steady, resolute, unshakable, and the words died in her throat. She scurried down the hallway, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She laid Anna Grace in the small cradle Will had fixed for her. The baby stirred, but didn't cry. Nora crouched beside the bed, straining to hear, her world shrinking to the sounds from the other room. 3 slow, arrogant knocks rattled the front door. A moment of silence. Then she heard the heavy bolt slide back. Will opened the door. The cold night air rushed in. From her hiding place, she could hear Silas's mocking voice drift down the hall. "Evening, Hargrove. I figured we could settle this man to man. No need to bother the sheriff with our family matters." Will said nothing. His silence was a weapon, heavier and more intimidating than any threat. "You're harboring my wife and child," Silas continued, his voice dripping with false righteousness. "You think that makes you some kind of hero? Some noble savior? All it makes you is a thief." Will's voice, when it finally came, was low and edged like broken glass. "She's not your wife, and that baby isn't yours." "So she told you that lie, did she?" Silas laughed, a hollow, ugly sound. "The poor, confused thing. She's weak. She needs a strong man like me to guide her." "You've done enough," Will said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "You leave this place, now." "Or what?" Silas sneered. "You gonna shoot me, Hargrove? I've heard the stories. I've heard you can't pull the trigger anymore, not since—" Silas let the sentence hang in the air, a cruel, unspoken reference to the tragedy that had shattered Will's world. Nora heard the soft scrape of a boot on the porch boards. Will must have taken a step forward. "Take one more step toward them," Will said, and his voice was so calm, so devoid of heat, that it was the most terrifying sound Nora had ever heard. "And I swear to God, I will put you in the ground right where you stand." The silence that followed was absolute. The wind died. The world held its breath. The hired gun shifted uneasily. "Silas," he muttered, his voice rough with fear. "Maybe this ain't a good idea." "Shut up!" Silas snapped, his pride stung. "I'm not leaving without what's mine." What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. A flash of steel sliced through the dark. There was a sharp thwack. From the hall, Nora couldn't see, but she heard the hired gun let out a choked gasp of terror. Will's voice cut through the night again, still eerily calm. "That was my hunting knife. It's now buried 2 inches deep in the porch beam, right next to your ear. The next one won't miss." There was another sound, the clean metallic click of a revolver's hammer being cocked. "This is your last warning," Will said. Drop the shotgun. Both of you get on your horses and ride. For the first time, raw, naked fear cracked through Silas's arrogant facade. Nora could hear it in his ragged breathing. He must have seen the look on Will's face, the cold, unblinking promise of death in his eyes. Silas cursed, a string of vile words muttered under his breath. He stumbled back down the steps, trying to cover his retreat with a shaky, unconvincing laugh. Fine, fine, have it your way. But you can't hide in here forever, Hargrove. This isn't over. The hired man needed no convincing. Nora heard the heavy clatter of the shotgun hitting the wooden porch. Will didn't lower his gun, not until he heard the frantic sound of 2 horses galloping away, their hoofbeats fading into the vast, lonely darkness. When the dust had settled and the silence had returned, he stepped back inside, closing and bolting the heavy door. Nora emerged from the hallway, her face pale but her eyes wide with a stunned awe. She looked at him as if she were seeing him for the very first time, not just the silent, grieving rancher, but a protector, a warrior. Is it over? She asked, her voice trembling. For tonight, Will said, his own voice still low and steady. He ejected the spent cartridges from his revolver and began to methodically reload it. But he'll be back, and he'll be angrier. She crossed the room, her legs shaky, still holding Anna Grace close to her chest. Without thinking, she reached out and laid a hand on his arm. The muscle beneath his shirt was as hard as iron. Thank you, she whispered, for standing up to him. For us. He met her gaze, and in the warm firelight, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding forged in shared danger. His hand came up, and with a surprising gentleness, he brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. The simple touch sent a jolt of warmth rushing through her. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song against the walls of the ranch, but inside, the fire burned bright, a beacon of defiance in the oppressive dark. Will placed the fully loaded revolver on the mantelpiece, his jaw set in a grim line. Tomorrow, he said, we make sure you're safe for good. Both of you. Nora held his gaze, a quiet determination rising in her own chest. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She wasn't just running. She was standing her ground. And for the first time in a very long time, she believed they might actually win. The morning after the attack was unnervingly quiet. A delicate layer of frost coated the world in a shimmering layer of white, making the ranch look serene and peaceful. It was a beautiful lie. Nora woke with a jolt, the ghost of Silas's mocking voice still ringing in her ears. She found herself clutching Anna Grace tighter than usual, her heart still pounding with the residual fear of the night before. Through the window, she saw William already out in the yard, his tall frame moving with a steady, measured rhythm as he fed the cattle. But she noticed the subtle difference in his posture, the way his shoulders were tensed, the way he kept scanning the distant tree line. The calm of the ranch was gone. It had been replaced by a fragile, high-strung vigilance. When he came back into the warm kitchen, his hat in his hand, his boots damp with melted frost, she was already at the stove heating milk for the baby. He paused in the doorway. "Did you sleep?" he asked, his voice low. "Not really," she admitted, not looking at him. I kept thinking he would come back." Will set his hat on the table and leaned his broad shoulder against the doorframe. "He'll stay quiet for a while," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "He's a coward, a bully. He hates being made to look like a fool. And last night, I made sure he looked like a fool." Nora looked down at her own hands. They were trembling. "He won't give up," she said, her voice shaking. "I know him. He'll twist everything. He'll go to the sheriff and tell everyone that I'm a madwoman who ran off with his child. He's good at lying. People always believe him." Will's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm, a pillar of strength. "Then we don't give him the chance to lie." He pushed himself off the doorframe and walked towards her. "If he comes here again, I'll handle it." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that she couldn't let him keep risking his life for them, but the look in his eyes, a look of unwavering, absolute resolve, silenced her. This wasn't just about protecting a stranger anymore. This was something deeper. This was a choice he had already made. As the day wore on, a fragile sense of normalcy returned. Nora took Anna Grace out onto the sun-drenched porch, wrapping the baby in a thick quilt and humming a soft lullaby. The cows moved lazily across the vast pasture, their bells clinking a gentle, hypnotic rhythm. She watched Will as he worked, repairing a section of broken fence. His sleeves were rolled up, the muscles in his powerful forearms flexing with each swing of the hammer. She found herself watching him, not just with gratitude for the safety he provided, but with a growing, unfamiliar feeling of admiration. There was a quiet strength in him that felt as solid and eternal as the mountains themselves. When he came over for a drink of water from the pail on the porch, his face beaded with sweat, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Have you always run this entire ranch by yourself?" He nodded, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "For years now. It was easier that way." "Easier than what?" She pressed gently, her voice soft. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the weathered planks of the porch. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, that he would retreat back into his fortress of silence. But then he spoke, his voice rough with a grief that was still raw. "My wife, my daughter, they died out there." He gestured vaguely toward the sprawling fields. "Caught in a blizzard. I was in town for supplies. By the time I got back—" He stopped, his throat tightening, the words catching. "I wasn't fast enough. I wasn't fast enough to save them." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, filled with the ghosts of a tragedy she could barely imagine. Nora's heart ached for him. "Will, I'm so sorry," she whispered. He gave a slight, sharp shake of his head, as if trying to physically dislodge the memory. "That's why I built the gate so high," he continued, his voice barely audible. "Kept everyone out. I figured if I was alone, I couldn't lose anyone else." Nora reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. The muscle was tense beneath her touch. "You saved us," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "You were fast enough for us. Maybe you were meant to." Something in his gaze shifted then. It was like watching a door that had been bolted shut for years slowly creak open. He didn't pull away from her touch, and for the first time, she saw past the grieving husband and father. She saw the man who was still there, the man who still had so much strength, so much heart left to give. That evening, Nora found a renewed purpose. She made a thick, hearty stew with vegetables from the root cellar. Anna Grace, now babbling and happy, played on a blanket on the floor, her cheerful sounds filling the quiet house with life. Will returned from the fields at dusk, weary and covered in dust. They ate together at the large wooden table, the fire crackling merrily in the hearth. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy or awkward. It was comfortable, companionable. After dinner, as Nora was clearing the dishes, Will reached into his pocket and placed a small, intricately carved wooden horse on the table. The wood was smooth and dark, worn from years of being handled. "I made this for my daughter," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. She never got to play with it." He pushed it gently across the table toward her. "Maybe Anna Grace. Maybe she can have it." Nora picked up the small horse, her fingers tracing the delicate carving. Her throat tightened. "She'll love it," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Will." Later that night, long after Anna Grace had been put to bed, Nora found herself sitting by the fire, watching Will as he meticulously cleaned his rifle. The firelight flickered across the hard planes of his face, casting him in shifting shadows of gold and black. "I used to dream of having a family," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out of her before she could stop them. A real one. Not just being owned by a man who saw me as his property. He looked up from the rifle, his hands still, his expression unreadable. What happened? He asked simply. Her breath caught. No one had ever asked. No one had ever wanted to know. The man I loved, Anna Grace's real father, he died before he ever got to meet her. A logging accident. The pain was still a fresh wound. After he was gone, Silas, he moved in. Like a vulture. He made me believe I was worthless, that I was tainted goods, that no one would ever want me or my child. He told me he was my only option, and I was so lost, so broken. I almost believed him. Until you. Will's hands, which had been so careful and gentle with the rifle, clenched into fists. He met her gaze across the flickering space between them, and there was a fierce, protective fire in his eyes. You are not worthless, he said, his voice a low, angry growl. You and that little girl, you deserve a hell of a lot better than men like him. His words hit her with the force of a physical blow. She blinked back the hot tears that stung her eyes, unable to look away from his intense gaze. For a long, charged moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the hiss and crackle of the fire and the distant, lonely sound of the wind sweeping across the plains. He finally set the rifle aside. He leaned back in his chair, his long legs stretched out towards the hearth, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. He'll come again, Will said, his voice low but steady as a rock. We need to be ready. Nora nodded. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. But it was different now. It was no longer the paralyzing terror of a lone victim. Now, she was not facing the darkness alone. She was standing shoulder to shoulder with a man made of iron and quiet decency. A man who was becoming something more than just a savior. He was becoming a partner. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that Silas's return would be the final battle. It would test everything they had started to build in this lonely house, and only one side would be left standing. The winter dragged on, a monotonous blur of gray skies and biting wind. But for Nora, life on the Hargrove Ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt like healing. The constant, demanding work of the ranch was a balm, leaving little time for her mind to wander into the dark corners of fear. Every morning, Will would rise before the sun, his tall figure a silhouette against the pale dawn as he tended to the cattle. Nora would stand on the porch, Anna Grace wrapped in a warm shawl, and watch him, her breath misting in the frigid air. By mid-February, Anna Grace was a different child. She was strong, sitting up on her own, her happy gurgles and sudden shrieks of laughter echoing through the quiet, solemn house like bells. She had grown attached to Will. Her eyes would follow him around the room, and she would break into a wide, gummy smile whenever he spoke to her in his low, rumbling voice. One evening, Nora walked into the main room to find Will sitting by the fire, holding the baby on his knee. He was murmuring to her softly, his head bent low, telling her secrets meant only for her ears. The sight made Nora's chest tighten with an emotion so warm and unfamiliar it almost frightened her. But the outside world had not forgotten them. The gossip in Meadowbrook had simmered, but it had not died. Judith Ramsey, the midwife, became their lifeline, sending word to the ranch every few days with one of Will's hired hands who came to pick up supplies. The news was unsettling. Silas was still lurking on the outskirts of town. He'd been seen in the saloon, buying drinks for rough-looking men, spinning his poisonous tale. He was painting himself as the victim, a distraught husband whose fragile wife had been lured away by the wealthy, reclusive Hargrove. He was claiming Will was holding them against their will. Will listened to these reports with a grim, silent stoicism. He never spoke of worry, but Nora saw it in the tightening of his jaw, the cold fire that entered his eyes whenever Silas's name was mentioned. "We can't keep hiding here forever," Nora said one night. They were in the kitchen, the air warm and smelling of baking bread. Her voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the crackle of the fire. "He's poisoning the whole town against you. He'll come back, and this time, he might not be alone." Will looked up from the table where he was mending a leather harness, his hands still. "Then we show them the truth," he said simply. "How?" she asked, turning to face him, her hands white with flour. "By living it," he replied, his gaze intense. "We let them see who you really are, who we are." He paused, the firelight dancing in his gray-blue eyes, illuminating the silver at his temples. "There's a spring fair in town next month, the first of the season. I want you and Anna Grace to come with me." Nora stared at him, stunned into silence. "Go to the fair? In front of everyone?" "What will they think? What will they say?" "Let them say what they want," he said, his voice resonating with a new confidence. He stood and walked toward her, closing the space between them. "People will always talk, Nora. They'll always whisper. But if they see you standing beside me, if they see that beautiful, healthy baby in your arms, they'll know Silas Grober is a liar. The truth is more powerful than his whispers." She hesitated. The idea was terrifying, but it was also strangely, powerfully liberating. For months, she had lived in the shadows, her identity defined by the man who hunted her. Maybe Will was right. Maybe the only way to fight a shadow was to step into the light. In the days that followed, the ranch was filled with a new energy. Will unearthed an old wagon from the barn, a sturdy buckboard that hadn't been used in years. He spent days sanding down the weathered wood, oiling the wheels, and polishing the old leather harness until it shone. Nora, for her part, mended the one good dress she owned, a simple blue gown that Judith had given her. She even fashioned a tiny, perfect bonnet for Anna Grace from scraps of white linen. When she placed it on her daughter's head, Anna Grace looked so beautiful, so pure, that Nora's heart felt like it might burst. On the morning of the fair, Nora woke to find Will already dressed. He wore a clean white shirt, his boots were polished to a high gleam, and his dark coat had been brushed free of dust. He looked every inch the powerful, wealthy rancher the town whispered about, but his quiet strength, his unpretentious manner, spoke of a man who valued integrity far more than wealth. As they rode toward Meadowbrook, the wagon loaded with blankets for the baby, Nora's stomach was a tight knot of nerves. She could feel the immense weight of this day. This wasn't just about her. It was about Will. He was deliberately stepping out of the shadows he had inhabited for so long, showing the world that he was no longer the silent, grieving ghost of the Hargrove Ranch. She glanced at him. His hands were steady on the reins, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When they arrived, the fairgrounds were a riot of color and sound. Children ran between brightly colored booths, vendors shouted about fresh-baked pies and warm cider, and a small band played cheerful, slightly off-key tunes near the town square. And then, the music seemed to falter. The conversations died down. Every head turned as William Hargrove guided his wagon into view. A woman was sitting beside him. A baby was in her arms. A wave of whispers rose from the crowd, a rustling tide of shock and speculation. Nora felt a hot flush creep up her neck, but she remembered Will's words. She lifted her chin, held Anna Grace a little tighter, and met their stares. Just then, a figure broke from the crowd. It was Judith Ramsey, her face beaming with a warm, approving smile. "Well now," she said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Don't you all look a picture?" She reached up, her wrinkled hand tickling Anna Grace under her chin, making the baby giggle. "And this little one is the very image of health." Will nodded, his stern expression softening as Judith cooed at the baby. "We thought it was time," he said simply. "No reason to hide anymore." Judith's sharp eyes twinkled as they moved from Will to Nora and back again. "Good," she said firmly. "It's high time people saw the truth with their own two eyes." As they walked through the fair, a strange thing began to happen. The hostile stares softened into looks of curiosity, then of admiration. Women stopped Nora to compliment Anna Grace's bright eyes and chubby cheeks. Men who had previously avoided Will's gaze now tipped their hats to him, their expressions a mixture of respect and awe. The whispers hadn't stopped, but their tone had changed. Silas's poisonous lies were beginning to wither under the bright, warm sun of the truth. Near the end of the day, Sheriff Ben Cormack approached them. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, his weathered face serious. "Afternoon, Will," he said, nodding respectfully to Nora. "Miss Whitfield." His gaze was steady, but his tone was unexpectedly kind. "Just so you know, Silas Grober hasn't been seen for a few days. My guess is, seeing you two here today, he figured his story wouldn't hold up much longer. I think he's left town. For now." "Thank you, Sheriff," Will said. And there was a new authority in his voice, a calm confidence that told Nora he was ready for whatever came next. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of pink and gold, they climbed back into the wagon. Anna Grace was fast asleep in Nora's arms, her tiny fingers curled around a corner of her new blanket. Will looked over at Nora, and for the first time, he smiled. A true, unguarded, genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. "You did well today," he said quietly. "So did you," she replied, her own heart feeling lighter than it had in years. The road home felt different. The tension that had been a constant, oppressive passenger for months had finally begun to ease. But they both knew this story wasn't over. A snake like Silas Grober doesn't just slither away. He finds a new place to hide, a new place to wait. And soon, they would have to face him one last time. The days following the fair were filled with a fragile, hopeful peace. The tide of gossip in Meadowbrook had turned. The image of the strong, silent William Hargrove tenderly holding a baby, with a brave young woman by his side, had been more powerful than any of Silas's lies. The townspeople, who had once whispered about a monster, now spoke with admiration about a man who had opened his home and his heart. But Nora knew Silas. His silence was not surrender. It was the quiet before the strike. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the mountains, painting the clouds in violent strokes of orange and purple, a rider appeared on the horizon, a lone figure moving fast. Will saw him first. He was on the porch, mending a saddle when his hands went still. He stared at the approaching figure, his body going rigid. He didn't need to see the man's face to know. Nora stepped out of the house, holding Anna Grace on her hip. She followed Will's gaze, and her own breath caught in her throat. "Silas," she whispered, the name a curse on her lips. Will set the saddle aside and stood up, his tall frame a formidable silhouette against the dying light. His voice was steady, but hard as granite. "Nora, go inside, take the baby and lock the door. No matter what you hear, you do not come out." She wanted to argue, to scream that she wouldn't hide while he faced this danger alone. But the look in his eyes, the cold, deadly command, left no room for debate. With trembling hands, she nodded, backing into the house as her heart hammered against her ribs. Silas rode recklessly into the yard, pulling his horse to a skidding halt. His face was a twisted mask of rage and desperation. He swung himself from the saddle, his movements jerky and aggressive. "Well," he drawled, his voice thick with venom, "doesn't this look cozy? My wife, my child, and the big rich man who thinks he can just steal them from me." Will stepped off the porch, his boots making no sound on the packed earth. His shadow stretched long and menacing across the yard. "She's not your wife," he said, his voice cold and flat. "And that baby will never be yours." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet evening. "You think because you're rich you can just change the truth? I've got papers, Hargrove, legal papers. I'll bring the law. I'll bring the whole damn county down on you." "I don't care what lies you've had written down," Will cut him off, his tone like the scraping of steel on stone. "Nora is free, and no one is ever taking her back to the hell you call a home." Silas's sneer faded, replaced by pure fury. He took a step closer, his hand twitching, moving instinctively toward the revolver holstered at his hip. "You really think you can stop me?" "I know I can," Will said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You try to lay one hand on them, and I promise you, you will never walk away from this ranch." The tension between the two men was a living thing, an electric current crackling in the air. It was the breathless, suffocating quiet that comes just before lightning strikes. Silas's hand went for his gun, but before his fingers could close around the grip, a new sound cut through the air. The thunder of hoofbeats. Not one horse, but several, coming hard and fast up the ranch road. Silas spun around, startled, his draw forgotten. Sheriff Ben Cormack galloped into the yard, his shotgun held ready. Right behind him were Judith Ramsey, her face set like stone, and two of the town's most respected ranchers, their own rifles resting in the crooks of their arms. They had seen Silas ride out of town, his face a mask of black rage, and they had known. "Silas Grober!" The sheriff's voice boomed across the yard. "You're done here!" Silas stared, his face draining of all color. "This is none of your business, Cormac. This is a family matter." "The hell it is," the sheriff retorted, swinging down from his horse. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I sent a wire to the magistrate in Helena. He confirmed it this morning. Your so-called marriage license is a forgery, a clumsy one at that. You've got no claim on Miss Whitfield or her child, none at all." "That's a lie!" Silas shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation. "No," Judith Ramsey cut in, her voice ringing with the fire of righteous fury as she stepped forward. "You are the liar, Silas Grober. I was the midwife who delivered Nora's baby, but I was also the midwife for another young woman years ago. A woman you claim to have married, a woman whose child you tried to steal after she was widowed. You're a predator who preys on grieving women, and your reign of terror is over." Silas's eyes darted wildly from Will's cold, impassive face to the sheriff's shotgun, to the hard, unforgiving eyes of the other men. The walls were closing in. His web of lies had finally collapsed. For one terrifying second, it looked like he might draw his weapon out of sheer, spiteful rage. Will's hand never wavered from his own revolver, ready for the final, bloody confrontation. The standoff stretched, breathless and taut. Then, with a final guttural curse, Silas spat on the ground. He backed away toward his horse, his bravado utterly shattered. "This isn't over," he hissed, but the words were empty, pathetic. "You'll all regret this." "Leave Montana," the sheriff commanded, his voice cold as a winter grave. "If I ever see your face in this county again, you'll spend the rest of your miserable life behind bars." Silas scrambled onto his horse and dug his heels in, galloping away like the devil himself was on his tail. He rode into the growing darkness until he was nothing more than a dark speck, swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was the silence of a fever that has finally broken. Nora stumbled out of the house, Anna Grace clutched tightly in her arms. Her legs were trembling so badly she could barely stand. She crossed the yard to Will. She didn't need to say anything. He simply reached out and put a steadying arm around her shoulders. "It's really over?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. Will looked down at her, his eyes softening. He gave a single, firm nod. "It's over. He won't be back." Judith came forward, her stern face breaking into a warm, gentle smile. "You're safe now, dear," she said, reaching for Anna Grace. "You both are. This little one deserves a life of peace." Nora's eyes filled with tears of overwhelming relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, looking at each of them in turn. Judith, the sheriff, the other ranchers. And then, finally, her eyes met Will's. "Thank you" wasn't enough. It would never be enough. This man hadn't just saved her life, he had given her a new one. Later that night, long after their visitors had gone and the ranch had settled back into its quiet rhythm, Will sat by the fire, bouncing a giggling Anna Grace on his knee. He was smiling that rare, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. Nora watched them from across the room, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it took her breath away. It was a feeling she had thought was lost to her forever. It was love. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said softly. Will looked up at her, his gray eyes steady and clear in the firelight. "I wanted to," he said simply. "You and Anna Grace, you belong here." He hesitated, his expression becoming serious. "If you want to stay—" Her breath caught in her throat. The firelight danced across his strong, kind face. "I do," she said, her voice trembling with a certainty that came from the very core of her soul. "More than anything, I want to stay, with you." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air was thick with unspoken promises. Then Will gently settled the sleeping baby into her cradle. He walked over to Nora and reached out, taking her hand in his. His rough, work-worn fingers curled around hers, a perfect fit. And in that moment, something deep inside Nora finally, truly settled. A feeling of safety, of peace, of home. Outside, the wind swept softly across the dark fields. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the quiet joy of their small, unlikely family filled the house. Spring was coming. It would bring new life to the land, new work, new beginnings. And for the first time, Nora wasn't afraid of the future. She was ready to build a life. Not one born from fear and survival, but one built on a foundation of courage and resilience and love. As Will stood beside her, his hand holding hers, their eyes fixed on the sleeping child who had brought them all together, it felt like the start of something more powerful and enduring than either of them had ever dared to dream. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of survival, justice, and the wild, unbreakable human spirit.